A Pew Research Center poll released last week showed that Americans view President Obama and the Republican challenger Mitt Romney as equally qualified to lead American foreign policy. When asked who can do a better job of making wise decisions about foreign policy, 47% of the voters chose President Obama and 43% of the voters chose Romney. This represents a substantial gain for Mitt Romney, who trailed President Obama by 15 points in the same poll in September. But what will be the top foreign policy priorities of the next U.S. president? And will the campaign rhetoric become sound policy once the dust settles from the election? Joining me now to discuss some of these issues are Daniel McCarthy, editor of the American Conservative magazine and a founding member of the Academy of Philosophy and Letters. And from Miami, Matthew Brodsky, Director of Policy for the Jewish Policy Center and editor of In Focus Quarterly. Daniel, Matthew, welcome to The Heat. Let me begin by asking you about all the agreement that occurred in this debate, the most recent foreign policy debate. It kind of surprised me. What was your take?
I thought it was very surprising as well. But I think what you've seen is that Mitt Romney is repositioning himself to the center on foreign policy as a way to make up for the deficit he's had until now with Barack Obama among polling on foreign policy. He's trying to make himself much more of a centrist candidate. Matthew,
what was your take?
The agreement that they had, it was absolutely surprising, not to be expected. The largest difference is in Iran. When it comes to Iran having a nuclear capability, that was a distinction that Mitt Romney made that Obama has not made. And the other distinction would be Syria. He would like to advocate a slightly more activist role, which I think, for obvious reasons, would be good for the United States. It's a strategic interest for us.
Let's see if we can't dissect some of the comments that came out. I want to get your take on a lot of these. Libya, of course, had kind of been viewed as perhaps the October surprise. The Romney campaign had hit on this over and over and over again. And it was the first question in this debate, and one would think that Romney would seize upon it, but he really didn't. His answer was surprisingly mild. Let's listen in.
But we can't kill our way out of this mess. We're going to have to put in place a very comprehensive and robust strategy to help the world of Islam and other parts of the world reject this radical, violent extremism, which it's certainly not on the run.
Matthew, why don't I begin with you? You surprised?
You know, he is right. He's hit the right point, which is if radical Islam is to be defeated, it has to be defeated in the region itself. And that's a strong point. The point he's making is that the United States shouldn't have allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to come into power. The U.S. should work to identify which groups in the countries of the so-called Arab Spring. We should work to identify groups that would be aligned with the United States, groups that are more liberal. And that's what we should have been doing in Syria all along. Once Assad goes, we'll need to have that set up. So it's good to hear him lay that out as a strategy, which I think is different than what the current president has done.
Daniel, let me ask you about Libya, because it seemed like the Romney campaign had really kind of seized on this and then kind of took their foot off the gas pedal, in a sense, during this debate.
Well, I think they understand that what we've seen happening in Libya could happen in Syria in the future. If the United States gets involved and supports one side, and if we see Assad toppled, there's no guarantee that whoever comes to power afterwards is going to be on America's side. So I think the Romney campaign is being a little bit cautious here about what they're projecting for the future.
Romney describing Iran as the biggest threat to U.S. security. Let's listen in.
The greatest threat that the world faces, the greatest national security threat, is a nuclear Iran.
Pretty succinct. Your thoughts?
Well, he's mistaken. I mean, obviously, a nuclear Pakistan is as much a threat as any kind of nuclear Iran could possibly be. We heard a lot of rhetoric during the Bush years hyping Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a threat, which in fact it was not. Really, there is not a scenario here in which a nuclear Iran could pose a threat to the United States. It's simply not true.
Matthew?
Iran is the biggest strategic threat to the United States currently. I think Romney did get that point 100% accurate. They're the biggest, foremost sponsor of worldwide terrorism. So them and their alignment with Syria, those are two countries that act as enemies to the United States. So them with nuclear weapons would be a catastrophe.
Okay, Matthew, you'd mentioned President Obama and the sanctions. He had a chance to talk about that. He touted his policy about the sanctions. Let's listen to that and we'll get more reaction.
We then organized the strongest coalition and the strongest sanctions against Iran in history, and it is crippling their economy. Their currency has dropped 80%. Their oil production has plunged to the lowest level since they were fighting a war with Iraq 20 years ago. So their economy is in a shambles. And the reason we did this is because a nuclear Iran is a threat to our national security, and it's a threat to Israel's national security. We cannot afford to have a nuclear arms race in the most volatile region of the world.
Now, Matthew, he says the same thing. We can't have it in that area, but he seems to be making a good case for sanctions and diplomacy. Your reaction?
Well, here's the problem. If you're measuring the effectiveness of sanctions by how much it affects the people, then yeah, they're effective. But it's not affecting the regime calculus as far as whether they want to have a nuclear weapon. So they're still going ahead enriching uranium. So you can affect the people, you can affect the economy, but how that lines up with affecting regime behavior is yet to be seen.
Daniel, your thoughts?
Well, that's something that both candidates really ought to confront. Sanctions are not the most effective way. They're not effective at all. We've had sanctions on Cuba for a very long time, and they never affected regime change. We had sanctions for a decade on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and yet we still heard claims that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, he wasn't, in fact, but the fact that anyone could believe that he was shows that even our political class doesn't really believe that sanctions are able to deter anyone.
Let me ask one final question before we head on out of here. Obviously, both of you have an interest in foreign policy. You're probably watching with a great deal of interest. I was watching as well, and it seemed to me that every chance they had to shift from foreign policy to Ohio or shift from foreign policy to Florida, that's what they did. They tried to bring it back to domestic issues. Disappointed in that, or not to be surprised?
Well, it's not entirely surprising. Obviously, domestic politics is what drives voters. But there is an electorate out there, a small number of disaffected independents and former Republicans who would like to vote for someone like Mitt Romney, but who have reservations about the Bush foreign policy. So what Romney was able to do last night in backing away from Bush's legacy was very important to him, I think.
Matthew?
I think Romney did a very good job. And deciding that he was going to be, come across as a far nicer Romney, which was, what I don't think we're expecting. It's going to have appeal probably with, core constituents that he's trying to pick up, specifically the women's group. I think he'll get some more votes that way. I think he came across looking more presidential. His demeanor was better, even as he sat by and allowed himself to get attacked by President Obama. So I think you'll see a different strategy for him after Election Day. You'll see hopefully some differences in the Middle East, because it's a mess.
Well, I think we can all agree on that. And in fact, I think the candidates would even agree with that as well. Daniel and Matthew, thank you both for joining us today. Certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.